afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to Science Sundays. I'm John Beacom, representing physics, astronomy, and the Center for Cosmology and Astroparticle Physics. I'm also representing a broader committee from across the arts and sciences, which spans natural and mathematical sciences, social and behavioral sciences, and arts and humanities. So what do we do in arts and sciences? What we're trying to do is push the boundaries of knowledge. That includes pushing for scientific discoveries, seeking to better understand the complexities of individuals and society, and to nurture creative expression. Now, what do we do with all of that research and scholarship? The first thing we do with it is we try to share it with our students, and that's part of what makes being here at Ohio State a world-class education. And the other part of what we try to do is to share it directly with the public. And Science Sundays is an important part of that. And we're grateful for your interest. So our speaker today is Professor Bart Elmore. He's a full professor in the Department of History. He's also a member of the Sustainability Institute. He's the author of 3 books, and he and his books have received numerous awards, and most, as the biggest highlight, in 2002 he won the Dan David Award, which is sort of like a MacArthur Prize for people in history. And that's a big deal, and we are delighted to have him here today. So let's welcome him.
Thank you all so much for being here on a cold Sunday. What a pleasure it is. It's a gift, really, to share with a room of so many smart people and to talk about issues that matter to all of us. So thank you for being here, and thank you for giving me the time just to share some time with you and talk about will genetically engineered foods help us feed a hungry planet? This talk is going to be based on a journey I took. I guess I started it around 2010, so almost over a decade now, but it took about a decade to write this book on the history of a company that I think was at the center of this journey, which is a company called Monsanto that started in St. Louis, Missouri in 1901. And became one of the largest sellers of genetically engineered seeds in the world by the end of the 20th century. And I wanted to get inside this company and learn, as historians do, and I see some of my colleagues here, I think we really care a lot about trying to tell a human story. And so, if we're looking for simple stories today, this won't be one of them. I think this is a story of interesting personal tales of people's lives, how they got involved in the company, how things may have shaped out one way but could have gone another. So this is a story, and in some ways it's going to be focused on that research on the history of Monsanto and thinking about how did we get to this point where we have so many of our commodity crops that are genetically engineered, and what might that mean for the future? And I can't wait to have a conversation with all of you, and I know we'll have a reception afterwards, and looking forward to a conversation there as well. So some of the things you're going to see here, I should probably just say, I was actually given access to Monsanto's corporate records in St. Louis. You have to get permission to use those records, and I was kind of surprised, to be honest with you, that I got into those records. They're housed, and I tell you this because I think of us as a collective group here in Ohio, doing investigative work or whatever you might be. They're at Washington University, these records, and they're quite extensive. I will tell you they've been sanitized. Corporate lawyers have been through them. You're not finding a lot of those smoking guns, but it's still a remarkable collection. And so when I can, I'll try and show you some of the documents and images from the archives. I should also say that after this book came out, the company sent me an email and said, "We've read your book." I'll just leave it there for now, and we'll talk about the rest of that later. But again, thank you for sharing time with me, and I'm going to dive right into the story here at the beginning, and we're going to go back in time to the beginning of Monsanto, and then we'll get to the story of ag, because if we start at the beginning, this is not a company that's interested in agriculture; it's interested in other things. And we'll start with again a human story. This is, again, from the records, the special collections in Washington University. This is an image. The man seated here is John Queeny, who was the founder of the company in 1901. His daughter, Olguita, is in his lap. They're about the same age as my kids. My kids are now 6 and 3. I just came from playing in the snow with them, so hopefully my mind won't be too frazzled. You can see John feels the same way, sitting there kind of frowning. And he's got Edgar here, who's next to him, who's going to take over the company in the 1920s from his dad. His wife, Olga Monsanto, there's the name. He names his firm after his wife. Given the lawsuits and liabilities that are currently facing Monsanto, one wonders whether that was a gift or not, given the current situation that we're in. The archives are interesting on this, though. If you're curious about why he calls it Monsanto and not Queeny, Queeny, after his own name, why doesn't he call it, his last name for his chemical company? And it's because he was doing this in the evenings, starting this company Monsanto in the evenings. He was working for another drug company during the day. And there's a really interesting letter in the archives that makes it very clear that one of the reasons he names this after his wife is to kind of create some separation between his daytime job and this nighttime experiment of creating this new chemical firm. And he does it in 1901. He is 40 years of age at the time. I really feel when I see these images, a person I can understand, He's actually tried to make it starting his own chemical business before this, but in East St. Louis, what now is Sauget, Illinois, just across the river from St. Louis, and it had burned down. He'd lost all of his savings, and now here he is, 40 years of age with 2 kids to feed a family. And so, these are hard times, and I think that tells you a little bit about the pace with which this company really pursued new chemicals and experimentation, trying to get things off the ground quickly. One could say that, as my great colleague Kate Brown at MIT has said, speed kills. Sometimes the pace in these early chapters with which they're trying to produce things leads to outcomes that have big consequences. But interestingly, the first chemicals that Monsanto is really interested in are not agricultural chemicals at all. They are specialty chemicals, as they would have been called then. These are chemicals that were primarily originally for the soft drink industry, which is the connection to how I even started doing this in the first place. I was writing a history of Coca-Cola and trying to figure out where Coca-Cola's caffeine came from. Now it's Googleable today, but you'll see me for that because I was doing a lot of digging to try and figure out how Coke sourced their caffeine. I'd written a whole 10-year project on Coca-Cola, and it led me to St. Louis. It turns out that this company was the company that produced the caffeine for Coca-Cola. And they did it in a wild way. They actually took the waste tea leaves that were left on the floor of tea exchanges around the world that nobody wanted. I always joke with the students, I say, you're now drinking those. They're now packaged in those yogi teas that look great and all this. But the broken and damaged tea leaves that nobody wanted had caffeine in them, and Monsanto was really effective at sweeping up that garbage. One could argue an environmental move here, recycling the waste of the tea industry to produce cheap caffeine for Coca-Cola. In fact, in the archives, you can see that Coke had to wait for the payments from Coca-Cola to pay their workers. That's how significant Coca-Cola's contracts were. And it was a big deal for them. They also sold Coca-Cola saccharin. Long before artificial sweeteners became popular in Diet Coke and other drinks, Coke was actually sweetening their beverages secretly with saccharin, an artificial sweetener that Monsanto was one of the major producers of in the United States and was selling it to Coca-Cola, and it was cheaper to do that with sugar prices fluctuating, and Coke did that without much of the public knowing it for many years, but made a lot of money. There's a great letter in the archives where years later there's an emphasis on this in the history, and somebody mentions, oh, those Coke contracts were so significant, and somebody says, don't downplay the Coke connection, because these were all trades that to some degree were quite obfuscated. So that's where we start, really. 1901, person down on his luck. He's had his business burned down once, and now he's trying to start it again. He's got this family here, and he's starting with saccharin, and there's saccharin you can see here even on diet drinks later in the 20th century, an artificial sweetener. That's the starting point. I should mention that the whole point of this, to some degree, is not just to make money, but for Queenie, he wants to beat out a company called Bayer, or if we're in Germany, Bayer. And if you think about Bayer, you're thinking of Bayer aspirin. This is a company that would have been, like many German chemical companies, in the lead in terms of organic chemistry, producing a lot of different products from coal tar, which is essentially the black syrupy substance that's left over after coal is turned into coke, not Coca-Cola. Coke that's often used for things like making steel and other things. And really, the Germans and Swiss and European chemical firms were in the lead, and Americans were far behind. And the idea here was to have this American independence from Germany. And that was the pitch that we'd see as we go into World War I, for example. That's how Monsanto grew in those years. We need American chemicals. We can't source them from that enemy overseas. We need to make it here. The great irony, of course, of all this is that in 2018, Bayer buys Monsanto. And I always think, what would Queenie think of this moment of Bayer actually taking over this company? The whole point was to liberate yourself from the Germans in the very beginning. But beginning in the 1920s, Monsanto starts really shifting into a variety of different chemicals, making a lot of their chemicals from a variety of fossil fuels, not just coal, but also petrochemicals coming from the oil industry and the oil refining industry. One of the biggest chemicals they invest in heavily is polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, which are in the headlines again today because, like PFAS, this is a chemical that is persistent in the environment and has created a tremendous amount of liability for this company, Monsanto, and now Bayer, which has taken on these legacy issues. And the interesting thing my father was an attorney, so I think about these things like litigation, and I sat in a lot of trials to get some of the documents as well. The litigation here is interesting because Monsanto was the only maker of PCBs in the United States. There were a couple other international producers of PCBs, but in terms of liability, when you see this chemical today, it can be traced back to two plants. One in Anniston, Alabama, where Monsanto made PCBs, and the other in Sauget, Illinois, which used to be called Monsanto, Illinois, until it became a Superfund site, and they began, I don't know, maybe we should change that to another name instead of having our brand on that site. But interestingly, Monsanto made this stuff, and it was everywhere. I mean, PCBs were a tremendous insulating material. It was used largely in electrical transformers, but it could be found, I was amazed at where it went. It was in the lining of pools that some of us swam in. It was in the silos that held our food. It was in the cereal boxes that held cereal for kids. It was in shoe polish. It was in artificial Christmas trees to prevent them from burning. The idea was a fire retardant. It was everywhere, and it ended up being this chemical that had huge environmental implications. And I'll come back to the 1940s and Agent Orange, but I just want to show you a document that I think is telling about a kind of corporate culture that had emerged by the 1960s. What you're seeing here is a confidential internal company document that was produced by an ad hoc committee in the 1969, where the company was trying to decide what to do with these PCBs. They were the sole manufacturer, essentially, around the world, but certainly in the United States. And as you can see at the top, subject is snowballing. It's a high-level executive in the room who's writing this. We've got a problem. By this point, the science has become clear that PCBs are particularly toxic, and the fact that they're out in the environment, in aquatic animals, and all sorts of spaces, this is a real problem. And you can see that as they're trying to figure out what to do, he writes down alternatives. Should we, one, go out of the business? Or two, should we, quote, sell the hell out of them as long as we can and do nothing else? Now, interestingly, also, you'll see at the bottom that customers, like General Electric, like many of their big customers who are buying these PCBs, didn't know the full story of what they were able to see internally with their own science. And the question was, what do we tell our customers? And I love to point out, as historians, we pay attention to the details of how people write things. It's not like he says sell the hell out of them. He goes back to put in the hell out of them and then puts it in a parentheses. That matters, right, when you think about this. These are the documents, folks, that as litigation unfolds now about PCBs and the environment that are still, for example, found in schools in Vermont, found in various places in streams and rivers from the Columbia Basin to the Ohio River, are really damning for Monsanto and Bayer, because it shows a kind of intent beyond just, oh, we didn't know there was a problem, but that they even wrote these things down, like sell the hell out of them as long as we can, I think are a really interesting moment for litigation. We can come back to that maybe in the Q&A. So I knew this history, and I knew as I got into this, I started seeing these documents and telling these stories. It really wasn't until the 1940s that Monsanto became invested heavily in agricultural chemicals and became, one could say, the ag company that we think of, in the latter part of the 20th century. Monsanto created its own DDT in the 1940s. It was actually branded Santoban. This, of course, is an insecticide that was widely used during World War II. It would come home and be used widely. Rachel Carson would write her famous book, Silent Spring, in 1962, that would ultimately lead to the banning of this insecticide due to the effects it was having on bird populations and other health effects. And so Monsanto was invested in that. Interestingly, they pulled out of DDT in the 1950s and were not as heavily invested in it as maybe other companies remained. There's even a fascinating letter in the archives where Edgar Queenie, that kid who's now at the top of the company, sees Rachel Carson's book coming out, and he writes a private letter to a friend in which he essentially admits she's got some things right. This is the kind of stuff, I think, for the students, especially in the room, who are thinking about science and history, why we in the history department want you to come over and hang out with us. Because you'll hear a lot about how companies approach scientists. And in this case, Rachel Carson, they tried to prevent her from publishing her book, and using sexist terminology at the time, describing her as not fit to be a scientist and all this kind of stuff. But privately, these documents are really revealing, showing that there was even a kind of acknowledgement that there was some truth to this, what was being said in these books. He doesn't go all the way there, though. He says, yeah, but she's wrong on a lot of things, and but still much more. In the archives, you'll see a different story than what you see publicly with Monsanto putting things out there. So they get into insecticides, but they also get into chemical defoliants, herbicides. And this becomes a big part of their brand, moving from the 40s all the way through the 50s, 60s, and onwards. They become one of the larger producers of two compounds. These are wonky names, but I know for this group that's not surprising. So we have 2,4-D, 2,4 with commas in between, then -D. A herbicide that became very popular not only as a wartime defoliant that could be used to clear out jungle environments, as we see in the Vietnam War, to expose troops, but also used on farms, also used in gardens, and also 2,4,5-T, 2,4,5-T, commas, -T. This again is a chemical compound that Monsanto makes a lot of money off of. It begins producing these compounds, 2,4,5-T specifically, in 1949. Those chemicals will be mixed in Agent Orange, about 50-50 concentrations of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. We now, of course, know that Agent Orange had a lot of adverse effects, including the fact that 2,4,5-T was contaminated with dioxin, a chemical compound that even Dow, writing to Monsanto privately in 1965, said is the most toxic compound we've ever seen. Now, when you think about litigation, again, there's another document where Monsanto admits that ours is a dirty process, that the way that they made 2,4,5-T had particularly high concentrations of dioxin in it. And they wrote it down, which has made the conversations today about what do we do about this even more important. 2,4,5-T, just because it's a local audience here, was manufactured by Monsanto in Nitro, West Virginia, about 3 hours from here, 2.5 hours east of here. That was where the majority of 2,4,5-T was manufactured by Monsanto. You might think of Dow Chemical Company when you think of the Vietnam War and Agent Orange, but it turns out that Monsanto was the largest producer by volume of the compounds that went into Agent Orange for the US military. They had the single highest liability in the cases that came out of the Vietnam War. That dioxin contamination is still in the environment, much like PCBs, in Vietnam. I traveled to Vietnam to watch that story unfold of the first cleanup operations that just began in 2012 to clean up the dioxin contamination from this herbicide, where it was stored specifically at Da Nang Air Base in Vietnam and also in Bien Hoa in the south. And it's a remarkable story because the USAID, with your taxpayer dollars, though you may not be aware of it, are paying for cleaning up through this thermal in-pile desorption. They're putting this soil into these concrete containers that they build that are about 2 football fields in length. I'm thinking of the horseshoe over there, just filled with all of this soil. They heat it to a remarkable temperature to denature the dioxin and then bring the soil back to the land. The first project cost about $300 million, and the next project is now ongoing at Bien Hoa in the south, just outside of Ho Chi Minh City in southern Vietnam. There's a real question of what is Bayer's responsibility or the company's responsibility to clean up these operations. Those companies have not paid for any of those cleanup operations, even though the documents show that they knew about some of the chemical problems within those issues going back decades. In fact, I went down to Nitro, West Virginia. I spent time with the documents there, and as early as 1949, the workers in the plant in Nitro, West Virginia were coming down with chloracne. It's a condition that makes your skin essentially turn into these acne-like pustules that actually, if you read the stories from the nurses who were treating these workers, it smelled of chlorine as the pustules would break. And I'm not trying to be graphic for graphic's sake, but they were seeing this in 1949. This is 2 decades before many people would go off to be exposed to Vietnam, and Vietnam veterans and others who would be exposed to this. So the record suggests that there was knowledge inside those plants that should have led to different actions down the road. But Agent Orange, of course, by 69 and 70, the Nixon White House is alerted by the scientists to the problems with this compound. It'll ultimately be banned for use by the US military. There'll be an operation to try and remove as much of this herbicide as they possibly can, the dioxin-contaminated herbicide from the war theater. There will be bans, of course, on the use of 2,4,5-T more broadly in the United States. And that is the timing for when Monsanto started to tinker with a new herbicide. The goal was to try and come up with a chemical herbicide that was more environmentally friendly and one that didn't have large health impacts. And the interesting story that in the archives that it didn't expect to see was that it also had the design of this particular herbicide, which became the first billion-dollar herbicide in history. It was a blockbuster product for Monsanto. It worked effectively well at killing a wide variety of weeds. And its active ingredient, of course, you'll see in the news, is, of course, glyphosate. There was a design issue here that's interesting. Monsanto was also a major producer of phosphate-based detergents. In fact, if you go to the grocery store after this talk and you're looking down the aisle at Kroger and you see all, lowercase all, that was a Monsanto product. It was one of their big detergents, and that was a big part of their business. In fact, they owned phosphate mines in Idaho, where they would take this phosphate, turn it into elemental phosphorus through a variety of processes, and then turn that phosphorus into this detergent. As we know, in the Great Lakes region, those phosphate-based detergents came under fire, with environmentalists saying it's contributing to eutrophication, algal blooms, and all sorts of things that are happening in the Great Lakes. And as a result, Monsanto had this huge investment in all these mines and phosphate and elemental phosphorus processing. By the way, same facility that was making this is going to make this glyphosate is also making phosphoric acid that's going to go to Coca-Cola. And I camped out there. I'm trying to cut things, but I only have 40 minutes with you. But I camped out at a Superfund site. And when I first started teaching this in my history classes, my students said, "Did you say super fun?" And I said, no, the opposite of super fun. Superfund, as in the 1980 Circle of Law, the Superfund Act, which of course designates certain sites as being particularly toxic and in need of cleanup. I camped out there. In fact, all the mining sites that are associated with Monsanto's Roundup they were all Superfund sites. The processing facility itself is also under Superfund designation, even though it still operates despite having this status, which is a remarkable story we can maybe talk about in the Q&A. But the point is, they had invested in all this infrastructure. They had all this phosphorus. They start playing with how we need an herbicide that might be able to use that elemental phosphorus. And that's where glyphosate comes out of it. Trying to get out of the detergent business, use that ingredient that was going into all, and now you're finding a new use for it. One scientist working on it described it as a strategic exit from the all business, which I think was really interesting. So that's the 70s, and I think these are all connected, these stories, in some way, in the archives. You're coming out of trying to find a solution to some chemicals that are creating some alarm, and you create a Roundup glyphosate active ingredient product that was billed as a safer alternative at the time. And then we got to pivot to get to this key point of where Monsanto becomes a seed seller. Because to this point, if you've been paying attention, they don't own a single seed company. They're not invested in that. They're a chemical company making a wide variety of things, from PCBs to Roundup and other things. That pivot, it turns out, to starting to try and become a seed company really starts so clearly in the archives in the energy crisis. You can see it very clearly. The executives are starting to get extremely concerned. As they put it in their annual report, today more than 80% of our products, the chemicals that we make, depend on hydrocarbons, depend on fossil fuels derived from oil and gas to make. At a time when some of us may remember that, stagflation, the Carter years, etc., when all this hits in 73, 74, and then again spike in 79, that became a big issue with the price of the raw materials to make those chemicals. Not just because prices were rising for oil and gas, but also because the major oil companies, Exxon, Chevron, and others, began integrating into owning and processing their own chemicals, creating their own divisions of chemical production. As they were saying in the archives, something that used to be given away to us, the petrochemical byproducts of refining oil, are now being used in-house. We're getting cut out of supply. We've got to pivot. And that's when Monsanto really makes a move to try and become the leader in biotechnology, especially biotech ag, and specifically working on a series of products to become a leader in certain commodity crops, specifically herbicide-tolerant crops, crops that can be genetically modified to tolerate or engineered to tolerate heavy spraying of different herbicides, and potentially other options. And we'll talk about BT in a second. Crops that can produce their own, essentially, insecticide, that can be genetically engineered to produce their own insecticide. We see that pivot again because of the energy crisis. Monsanto begins that transition, as you see in the subtitle here, by the 1980s. They're hiring the top folks that are studying this new and emerging science and biotechnology and life sciences, and trying to become a leader in this. If you look at the shareholders and others, they were really scared by this. Can they do this? It was going to be a wholesale rebranding of the company. Can they actually make the pivot in time to be profitable and to, make this worth the investment? But they do, and there's a series of other startups that are competing. It's a hot and contested race to see who can create these different crops. Monsanto is successful ultimately with creating a Roundup Ready technology, a crop that can essentially tolerate a spraying of its signature herbicide, Roundup, during the growing season. And that's the key. The key is, you could have sprayed Roundup before, but the idea is that you can spray this over top the crop during the growing season. It's genetically engineered, so your crop's going to be okay, but the weeds will be killed. This is a great system. If you talk to farmers or if you spend time with the great extension service that I have here at Ohio State, shout out to Ohio State. What an amazing team of weed scientists and researchers we have here who took me under their wing to go talk to people about that experience of buying these seeds that were Roundup Ready for the first time. And just to put a date on it, 1996, we're starting to see the emergence of that technology and commercialization. You can see the widespread adoption almost overnight. I've worked on a cattle farm. I spent a lot of time with farmers. They'll tell you it wasn't like we were just adopting this because we were just doing it for, I don't know why we did it. It made sense, made things a lot easier. It was an incredible, the oral histories I did, it was magic, it was magic, it was magic. It was incredible how it kept fields clean and how the technology worked. It allowed us to reduce our dependence on a variety of other herbicides, which we saw as more toxic. This seemed like a really great thing. And you can see again, herbicide tolerant, that's the HT there. Most of this would be glyphosate tolerant, so Roundup Ready technology. You can see that again in cotton and also in corn. And you can see that adoption by the time we get to the 20-teens, 90% of corn, soybeans, things like this are going to have that technology in it. And Monsanto was at the forefront of this. They had to do a series of remarkably aggressive mergers to try and buy seed companies. And ultimately, by the end of the 1990s, will become the largest seed seller in the world. It's an incredible process of trying to identify, for example, Delta pine and land down in Mississippi and getting the best cotton germplasm they can, going to other parts, not only of the United States, but then going down to Brazil, doing the same thing there and acquiring these seed companies so they can deploy this technology. They also, of course, introduced BT technology, as I said. BT comes from the Bacillus thuringiensis, a bacterium that's essentially produces this protein that acts as an insecticide. And the idea is, can we take that gene that's inside Bacillus thuringiensis, adapt it, put it into plants so that the plants can themselves produce their pesticide, an insecticide, and eliminate insecticides that might harm yields. And you can see that adoption kind of going at essentially similar rates, slightly different with different commodity crops, but we see that over time. For the remainder of the time that I have, what I'm going to do is just talk about HT, the Roundup Ready, and talk about what history can say about this. And I have no doubt that there's probably some wonderful folks who know a lot about this, either as farmers in the room or people who work on this as scientists. So I'm going to talk about it from a historical angle. What was useful for this book coming out is we were essentially, when I was trying to publish it, COVID kind of messed things up. We were at the 25-year mark for thinking about what can we say about the deployment of this technology. And one of the things you can say is that Monsanto sold quite a bit of glyphosate. Of course, Roundup there would be generic glyphosate with patents expiring. Other companies would also be selling glyphosate, but this is a story just visually that you can see from the USGS Pesticide National Synthesis Program that shows you the change as we go from 1992, before Roundup Ready technology, to essentially years later, 2017, with that widespread adoption of Roundup Ready. We just saw an explosion in the use of Roundup Ready traits, and as a result, Roundup as well. Glyphosate, more specifically, if we think about generics being used, and this gives you a sense, if we think about Ohio, just the changes in our own backyard that have taken place with this chemical use over time. Now, I got to talk to people at the highest levels of the company. I got to talk to scientists in the middle of the company. And again, for me, I was trying to tell a human story here about what was happening. The CEO at the time was Bob Shapiro in the 1990s. And he said, look, this technology is smart. By selling this new Roundup Ready technology, we're going to actually be able to reduce farmers' dependence on herbicides in the long run. We're going to make plants smarter. As he put it, we're selling information, not stuff. And as a result, we're going to see a reduction in herbicide use overall. And this is just looking at soybeans, pounds per acre, and I'm looking at a series of states that are major soybean producers. This was data sets that we had complete sets for the years that we were looking at it. And we were looking at pounds of herbicide per acre of soybeans over time. 1996 is the year of the introduction of Roundup Ready crops. And you can see that Shapiro's argument actually makes sense. What you're seeing here are all other herbicides, okay, on the dotted line going down over time for these farmers. In other words, because they have Roundup Ready technology, they don't need to depend on all those other herbicides that they had been using to try and beat back weeds. They had this one great herbicide, glyphosate. They had a technology that allowed their crops to tolerate that herbicide, so they could depend on that herbicide. Now, smart people in the room would be saying, well, wait a minute, though. If you put that kind of selection pressure of that much Roundup on the environment, will weeds adapt? Journal articles in the middle of the 1990s written by Monsanto argued that Roundup would not create Roundup-resistant weeds. And I document those articles in the book. They said, we've seen years of Roundup use. We have not seen weeds develop resistance to Roundup. And so we don't suspect it for the future. So all seems well, right? You see this decline, and you see glyphosate going up. By the way, that's the dark line. But you're seeing that reduction. Shapiro seems right, and for farmers too, it makes sense. This is not like, why do I do this? It seems obvious why you would adopt this new technology. But I spent time, again, with folks here, great weed scientists, and we talked about these years right in the middle, where they were beginning to see as early as the 2000s, weeds developing resistance to glyphosate. And it's a basic evolutionary story here, right? You're putting tremendous selection pressure on those weeds, and you're starting to see weeds that are not able to be killed by those weed killers. The stories I heard from folks here were really remarkable. A story of one individual who had a Monsanto rep come into his greenhouse here at Ohio State. And the rep told him, he said, look, I hear you're suggesting there's might be resistance here or tolerance to being developed by this particular weed to Roundup, but you're not seeing that. And this particular research scientist looked at his graduate student and said, okay, I'd like for you to leave the room. And then in our oral history, he said, I used a few words that I won't use here, but he read the riot act, he said, to this Monsanto rep. He said, we've been here at Ohio State doing this for 30 years. You don't come in here and tell us we don't know what we're seeing out in these fields. We're seeing glyphosate resistance, and you need to be forthcoming about that. The reality is farmers are smart. I mean, at some point, you don't even have to have the science. You can see it in your fields. Weeds were developing resistance to this technology, to this chemical. As a result, you start seeing, and you can see it here on this graph, this return to the older chemicals and older chemistry in some ways, whether it be 2,4-D or whether it be dicamba, which I'll come to at the end of the talk today. And you can see with that crossing there, not only was Shapiro not accurate about we're going to be just using glyphosate and a lot less of everything else. We're now using a lot of glyphosate and a lot of other things to try and keep back those weeds. Another way of looking at the chart is kind of looking at it over time. And again, you can see that buy-in period in the 90s. Yeah, overall total herbicides are going down like this. And then you kind of see this escalation as resistance hits, and you need to turn to other different herbicides to deal with it. So I just have a few minutes left with you. I want to end with one story about why I think this matters as we think about genetically engineered crops in the future. And I want to say something here so that I'm clear. CRISPR and new technologies are emerging. There could be remarkable uses for genetic engineering. I'm not here to be a person who's trying to scare folks away from the potentials of technology and what could be done. I am here as a historian and not a weed scientist to say what the historical record talks about the deployment of GE technology, how it was deployed, and the consequences of that deployment. And I think as we think about the future of GE technology, we need to think about this history. There's a lot of smart scientists in the room who are probably thinking about the next best thing. I'm excited to chat with you. I'd love to hear what you got up your sleeve, because I'm curious about what the next generation might be. But what we see in this history are some missteps. One was arguing that you wouldn't see that kind of resistance cycle, and we've seen that. And the other was the solutions, and here was one of them. One of the solutions proposed by Monsanto was to develop stack traits, that is to say, crops that would have multiple tolerances to different herbicides. The idea being that if, look, you can spray glyphosate, but if your weeds are developing resistance to glyphosate, you can also spray another chemical, and we'll genetically engineer your crop to be resistant to both of those herbicides. Does that make sense? And we started seeing in 2015 the deployment in soybeans and cotton of what was known as Extend. This was extending, in some ways, the life of that Roundup Ready technology, called Extendiflex here. This is Bollgard, so this is cotton. This is a seed from Delta Pine acquired by Monsanto. So we're looking at really good germplasm for cotton. And we're saying, do not, I'll get to this in a second. But you see a sticker on this. So just let me be clear here. This is 2015. The idea is we're selling farmers a seed that now will allow you to spray glyphosate on your crop and dicamba, a chemical first commercialized in the 1960s, older than Roundup. And the Roundup will kill a lot of the weeds, and dicamba will kill those weeds that are not killed by Roundup that have developed resistance to Roundup. Does that make sense? But the only problem is they put a sticker on it in 2015 that says, now, you want to see it? Let's see what the sticker says. Do not apply dicamba herbicide in crop, that is during the growing season, in this Bollgard 2 Extendiflex cotton in 2015. So let's just unpack that as you process reading that for a second. You as a farmer have just bought seed that allows you to spray this chemical, dicamba, in crop during the growing season because it's genetically engineered to do that. And they're putting a sticker on it that says, don't do that. And the reason they had to do that is because the EPA is in charge of approving herbicide formulations for use on farms. And the EPA had not approved dicamba for use in crop during the growing season in 2015. And the reason they hadn't done that is because, as many scientists and weed scientists will tell you, dicamba can be volatile. It can often move off target. We call this dicamba drift. It is, unlike glyphosate, it has a real extreme tendency to be able, especially in hot temperatures, to move off target. And there was no formulation to keep dicamba in place on the crop where it was sprayed. And the problem is, once it moves, it can hit farmers nearby. Now, I got 5 minutes with you, and then we'll go to Q&A. This was happening as I'm writing it. I'm not a weed scientist. I'm here with the great folks here at Ohio State, but I'm actually going to lunch with folks, and they're telling me about what's happening here over at the Heirloom, which we all hopefully love. If you don't know, keep it quiet. It's down there in the Wex. For those who love it, it's a nice spot to meet with folks and talk. And I'm hearing about this dicamba drift issue as I'm writing. I'm like 6 or 7 years into this project. And I decide ultimately to go to the court case where a farmer in Missouri, Bill Bader, brought suit against Monsanto for this drift issue. Because as you might imagine, while there are dicamba-tolerant soybeans and you can buy dicamba-tolerant cotton from Monsanto, there is no dicamba-tolerant peach. And there are vineyards as well that can be susceptible to this, and a whole host of other crops. Soybeans that don't have Monsanto seed can be affected by this, organic soybean growers. So when I went to this trial in 2020, I didn't know what I was going to find, but I wanted to know, did they know? Given the history I've unfolded for you, the corporate culture I've seen at times where they said things internally about what they knew I was primed to say, well, maybe this is a different class and a different group. Maybe there's a different story here. But I remember sitting in the opening statements. There were about 12 Monsanto lawyers over here and 2 Missouri lawyers, plaintiffs right here. And I watched as this lawyer just laid out these remarkable documents that told a story. I didn't know if there was going to be a gag order on the exhibits, whether we'd be able to share them or not. I'm happy to say that I can share them with you now, so I'm going to show you one of those exhibits. This is exhibit number 22 in the Bader Farms case. This was Bader Farms, Monsanto, and BASF. BASF has their own dicamba formulation, Ingenia, that they were selling as well. Monsanto's herbicide was called Extendamax that they were selling. And so this was about that dicamba drift. And you can see here that this is them, and you can see it's marked confidential, company confidential. This is their sales team. How do we get a farmer who is a grower who doesn't have resistance issues? You know, they're not seeing a lot of weeds that are developing resistance to Roundup. How do we sell this new Extend technology to them? Why would I pay for something I don't need? And you can see up here, define the value through education, greater sustainability of weed control, flexibility, and the kicker is the third. You know, they said it. They said protection from your neighbor. They knew that if you were a farmer over here that was maybe using conventional varieties or just using Roundup Ready and not Extend, that you could get hit. And a selling point would be, you might want to buy our seeds because you might get hit by that drift. Last slide, and then I'm done, and we'll have a conversation. This is the email that was also dropped. You got to remember, I was teaching here at Ohio State. I had a student in my class. I didn't have these documents, and I told them about what was going on. And afterwards, the student came up to me, and I said, I'm going to this trial tomorrow in Missouri. And the student said, I'm coming with you. You know, and it was such a moment because I needed someone in the room. And the student was incredible because jotting down notes with me because we couldn't have recorders in the room. We couldn't capture it. We had to do it visually, so I had to remember which exhibits and all that kind of stuff to go back. So shout out to that student who I'm unnamed for right now, but maybe we'll come back to it. You were right. This is an email that we saw, exhibit number 521. They joked about it in their emails. This is a member of the soybean team who's part of this Extend platform. And you can see, actually, soybean pays my salary and I get a weekly lunch from the cotton team. That I get to work with a group of renegades that launch a technology without a label. That is to say, launch a technology before there's an herbicide approved to be used on it. And think one sticker is going to keep us out of jail. If that was the case, Rylander, who's part of this team, would be covered in stickers. So they knew, for example, that people would find generic dicamba, that they would spray it, that it would drift. When the Extendamax came out, it also drifted. And incidence reports of drift were reported by folks all across the country. The EPA is still dealing with that. So this is an issue that's in our backyard, but it's a history that I think is right now. And it's not to say, again, that these technologies might not be useful, but what we've seen in the last 25 years is a kind of deployment of these technology that raises real questions, right? About whether we're in a cycle that's solving problems, or whether we're actually buying problems that are being sold by the very company that's selling it to you, right? Dicamba resistance, you can imagine this is a cycle. You spray that much dicamba, well, then you're going to need 3.0. You're going to need one that has 4 different herbicide tolerances. And then where do you go from there? A lot of weed scientists will say here, you're shepherding these chemicals and these really powerful formulations that can be burned up if used inappropriately. So I probably raised more questions than answers, which is why we're going to have a Q&A. I really thank you for your time. This is a gift for me, and I look forward to the conversation here and at the reception. Thank you so much. Thanks.
All right, we can take some questions for Professor Elmore. So the way this works is put your hand up, and I try to call on people. I won't be able to get to everybody, but you'll have a chance to ask more at the reception. And we have a standing rule here that If there's any students, we call on them first. So, you're the closest. Hi.
Hi. At the outset, you said that you got a note from the people at Monsanto that they had read your book. And then what happened?
It was a scary day, you know. Not because, you know, to be honest, when I first started this book, my brother was in Alaska, and I'd come across doing this book because I'd been writing about Coke. There was no, you know, I have this vendetta or I want to go write this expose. In fact, I really did not want to write a book that didn't have nuance, you know. And my brother sent me, I said, I'm writing this book on Monsanto, and he sent me this picture from Anchorage of a bumper sticker that said Monsatan. And he said, good luck, bro. And I thought, well, I know that history. And I think a lot of us, maybe even coming into the room, know that history. And I really wanted to understand why and how did this all unfold. You saw a lot of documents today, in part because they're shiny, that tell the story of the folks who made the bad decision. I think as environmental historians, that is important for us to do. I often hear students say, well, it was a different time, they didn't know. One of our jobs is to say, what did they know and when did they know it? And that's hard because you've got to go fly to trials, you know, in the middle of courses and hear the docs for the first time. So you'll see those stories there. But I also met a lot of people in the company who really believe, hey, we're trying to figure out how to solve some of these problems. And I actually disagree with the deployment of this, or I pushed back against that. There's a whistleblower in this book who was trying to blow the whistle on some of the stuff we just talked about. And, you know, felt like at the bench level of science, there was a lot of good being trying to be done, and there were these decisions being made maybe in that ad hoc committee that were bad. This is a long way of saying I wasn't sure which side I was going to get. You know, Monsanto was very litigious. I'd watched them go through trials. I'd seen how they behave. I'd seen the 12 lawyers. I was imagining the 12 and me. I always tell the students, and I see some of them here, you know, for me, it matters what we do in history. It's a powerful thing when you document those documents because it gives you a kind of protection. You know, when you say, look, I'm showing you the documents. I'm not trying to use modifiers, saying the evil corporation or Monsanto this or that. You look at these docs and making sure that, you know, the footnotes are 100 pages long so that people can go and trace the story themselves. But, you know, nevertheless, pause when you get a letter from the company. I think I'd just been on Joe Rogan, too, and I was trying to think, what did I say in 3 hours talking to Joe Rogan? You know, that I might be misconstrued or whatever. But the email said, yeah, I've read your book, and congratulations, and I've learned a lot, and I'd really like to talk. And I get this is weird, but if you'd be up for it, I'd be up for it too. And of course I thought, what is this? You know, what is this? What's the strategy? Is this real? Is this not? Is it the people I've met that are, you know, and this is Bayer. And I came to find out that this person, you know, was one of those people who really wanted to try and shake up the company. He had been elected to the German Bundestag at 23, the youngest person elected to the Bundestag in history. He had been he had designed the Green Party platform in Germany. He had essentially left government because he felt like he wasn't changing things fast enough with climate change and everything else. He said, I want to go inside the biggest companies in the world and see if we can change it. And I think it's another testament to understanding in history, you know, it's not all bad guys and trying to figure it out. My demand, though, because I was still wondering what the intention was, to say, if you're going to go on the record, I want you to come here to Ohio State. And I want you to do it in front of my students, and I want to film you with a documentary film company. And if you agree to that, then we can do it. And we get to control the film. And he said, I'll do it. And so he came here. I remember him standing outside my house, and it was the first time I remember seeing him, and who I can only describe as like a handler, just making sure he doesn't go off the rails and create another lawsuit. They're standing there kind of talking in German, and I don't speak German. And I could tell there was pressure on him, whether he was really going to come into the house and when the cameras were going to roll and see what was going to happen next. It was weird when he walked into my house, and he said, now I know where you live. But but honestly, we had an amazing moment in Thompson Library at the top where we filmed an hour-and-a-half conversation about what we could do differently. And you know, I think Bayer's perspective is we bought something, and some of the people in the company weren't quite sure what they bought. I think some of them did and thought they could get around stuff. These are people who are like, okay, we bought something, how can we figure out how to do better? And that includes Agent Orange cleanup. For the first time ever, could Bayer be involved in going to Vietnam and being a part of that cleanup? Long answer, but it was one of those long journeys for me. So that's where we're at right now, is pushing the company to have conversations about what they could do now.
Okay, go ahead, sir, and Bart will repeat the question.
I was curious, what is, out of people which you would consider design, 15 or 12 lawyers and yourself, side by side, what's a Massachusetts policy on protecting the family?
Are there admins in the room?
So how does it provide a legal team for you?
The question is essentially, what is Ohio State's role in protecting historians or others who do this type of work? Do the lawyers, look out for you? Let me answer it by just saying, this is important for especially the students I see in the room and others who are writers. You really need to look after yourself. It was what I found. And I don't think this university has allowed me to do things that I don't think I could have ever done had I not been supported by OSU. So I'll say that. But I certainly didn't expect or anticipate their lawyers to look out for my personal interests. So one of the things I did was, well, there's two things. One, I had a conversation with Michael Pollan, who wrote Omnivore's Dilemma years ago. He has office hours at Columbia University. You can just knock on the door. I did, and I knocked on the door, and he says, hey, I'm Michael. And I said, Pollan, and he told me about writer's insurance, which you can purchase, which is pretty remarkable. It's a insurance just like renter's insurance, fairly small amount, but it gives you massive coverage in case of a libel suit or something like that. So I had that in my back pocket. I told you my father was an attorney. For me, I talk about a certain privilege there that I had, essentially pro bono support, which I don't think I would have done the same work I did. And trust me, I talked to them. What are the things we need to think about? How do you frame things? What are the ways to make sure I'm protected? In the case of the whistleblower, if you have any ethics at all, you should tell those folks to get their own lawyer. He said, can I talk to your lawyer? I said, no, you shouldn't talk to my lawyer. You should talk to your own lawyer about what the best step is for you. The Koch book, I had no conversations with the lawyers at Norton, which is the trade press I wrote for. I definitely had conversations with the lawyers at Norton, the trade press there. So the point is, the lawyers I interacted with were lawyers that I had and lawyers at the press and not OSU. And so that was my story, and I think it's important for younger folks. You kind of have to look out for yourself, because OSU has its own thing it's got to look out for.
Go ahead, young man.
The question is essentially, are there chemicals that might reduce climate change, or a way of deploying this technology that might actually help with climate change in the future? I think the good news that I'm finding from inside the company is, at least among these very high up folks who are thinking about pivoting where Bayer is going to go, is they keep saying we need to be thinking about biology, not just chemistry. In other words, if you go back to the slide that we had in the middle of all this, a lot of this chemistry is 1940s stuff or 50s, and it's kind of a war mentality. In fact, if you think about 2,4-D and 2,4-5, these were deployed during war. My advisor, Ed Russell, has written a book called War in Nature, where he talks about how these chemicals came out of this kind of concept of a war against nature. Even the idea of the pest, you got to kind of rid it, annihilate it, fight it. And what I'm hearing inside Bayer is something that my advisors really tried to work on for 20, 30, 40 years, which is getting us beyond that mentality. And that's going to require biomimicry, that is thinking about design as if nature had something to tell us, as opposed to thinking of it as this brute force instruments throughout that. And I'm really pleased to hear that that's the direction that some really high up people are thinking. Like, in other words, they're saying, on dicamba, if you sit around at lunch, as I have with some of these folks, they'll say, we know. I mean, of course, I'm saying, okay, well, let's go. Let's move on this. Here's the EPA, 2021, still saying number of incidences of dicamba drift are still happening. I sat down at one meeting recently. He said, "You're impatient." I said, "I am, because I can see the history and I can hear your voice." And so you're saying that you want to move towards a more biomimicry model and bioengineering that's focusing on nature as an ally as opposed to an enemy. Let's see it. So, but at least the conversation's happening inside those doors, because I think that's the hope for the future.
Okay, let's take one more question. Let's see. Oh, yeah, there's so many hands. How about you, ma'am?
Is there something that historians can offer to the future? Because it is a bit unique. I get the label where people will say he's a journalist, and I always joke. I say, sure, it's okay with me that I take a little bit from the journalistic approach, which is to be there in the courtroom to see the documents, which, by the way, are from the past. So it turns out that spending time with our journalist friends is important. I don't find that a label that bothers me at all. I'm happy to be a historian and also someone who takes something from. I think the biggest advice I say is take from whatever discipline is useful, and apply it, as opposed to trying to stay in your kind of silo and do it. I felt very uncomfortable in these conversations and relationship, because my role, I feel most comfortable in documenting. You can even see it in how I feel, like even right now. Like participating in trials at this point. This book I know is used in the trials, and the question is expert witness. Is that the role of a historian? At what point do you lose, what we do, which is a certain distance from the present? I could see that argument both ways. What happens when you invite in the CEO of the company you just wrote about into your house? What's lost, what's gained? Maybe that's a great invitation to the reception, because I'm still working on that. I don't have the answers, but thanks for the question.
So we'll have a chance to ask Professor Elmore some more questions at the reception. Have a cookie, have a coffee, whatever. It should be upstairs in the traditions room. 90% sure of that. Last time I was 90% sure and I was 100% wrong. It's either in the traditions room upstairs or maybe in the Great Hall, but we'll figure it out, and we'll see you there. And let's thank Professor Elmore.
Thank you all very much.